Right away, the helicopter ride seemed simple. It seemed safe, but for me, it ended in a disaster, a total disaster. Like I say, never do this to yourself. I got myself dropped by a helicopter into a quagmire. Now, the helicopter on which I rode was an emergency helicopter used for transporting patients, and at the time I was a reporter for a local newspaper in Reno, Nevada. And I intended to do a story about the helicopter ride and about how the medical personnel, the professional medical personnel on board, would treat a patient once we arrived at a disaster scene. I didn't know that the disaster was going to be for me as well. I didn't know as we took off from the local hospital, which at the time was called Washoe Medical Center. I had no idea that this helicopter on which I rode was going to drop me right into a muddy quagmire. It's a story I'll always remember for the rest of my life. As we took off from the hospital area, everything seemed fine. I looked up and it was so fun to look out the window, and I was chatting with two or three nurses. I believe there were at least three nurses on board that were trained to go to horrific disasters and help medical attention to people that suffered injuries or heart attacks or whatnot. So we uh, went above the city of Reno, and I looked down, and I think this was the first helicopter ride I'd ever taken. And there were windows all around, and I had a full view of the community, and it was just a glorious sight. And I was not at that time worried at all about me or what could happen to me. That was the furthest thing from my mind. So we went and we took off and we flew above the northern edge of Reno, not toward downtown, but toward the northwestern edge of Reno. I looked out the window and it was like, oh my gosh, I feel like a bird. It was a glorious feeling at that time. And the vistas all around. Reno is in a place called the Truckee Meadows, which is tucked in what I refer to as a large valley. It's not technically a valley, but there's mountains that surround the entire area, including to the west of us. It was the Sierra Range, and the Sierra Range is quite famous, and it's along the Sierra Range is the Nevada-California border. But we were not headed in that direction right away. And so we went in the helicopter to the local airport, to the Reno airport. And at the time, the airport was called Reno Cannon International Airport. And the cannon was named after a person that was a former Nevada state senator named Howard Cannon. Subsequently, today the airport is called the Reno Tahoe International Airport, but I'm just putting this into perspective for you. So the aircraft landed at the airport to fuel up. That's the way this is done. The aircraft needed to get the proper amount of fuel to do the job, to take the trek to the disaster site. We had been informed as soon as we took off to go to the airport that the disaster was in California along US Highway 395. And so it was about, I'm just guesstimating, 100 miles from Reno, maybe 125 miles from Reno that we needed to go. It might have been a little further, but we landed at the airport as scheduled, and we're fueling up. They had to put a proper amount of fuel into the helicopter so that the helicopter would have just enough fuel to take us to where we were going and taking us back. At that time, as I recall, I had to give them my weight as well, and as I remember, I was about 220 pounds at that time, a little bit chunky. around 6 foot tall at that time. Right now, I'm about 190 pounds. And as the aging process is, right now, I'm just saying this to keep this in perspective. I'm about 190 pounds and 5 feet 11 inches tall because I've shrunk because of the aging process. In any event, we needed that specifically so that the aircraft could be able to fly to where we were going, pick up the victim, the person that was suffering from whatever he was suffering from, and take him immediately to the Reno hospital because the Reno hospital had far better, far more advanced medical technology than the place where the person was suffering. And we were told that the person down there in California, along close to U.S. Highway 395, had suffered from an apparent heart attack. And so it was critical for us to get to that person as soon as possible and to get the individual back. And so I was there to chronicle the situation for an article that I planned to do for the local paper. Well, we took off from the Reno airport, of course, as intended, and we reached a certain height, and that was great. We were way over the Truckee Meadows, and we passed what is known as Mount Rose and Slide Mountain to our right, and those peaks are famous in this area because they're along the edges of Lake Tahoe, the world's famous lake. And so we went up barely high enough to see just little bits of the lake, but not much. And so that was great. And to our left, we saw all kinds of valleys. To our left would have been uh, uh, places of the historic old, some people call it a ghost town. It's not a ghost town, it's called Virginia City. But as we got up, the skies that had been so pleasant just as we took off were suddenly starting to get cloudy. And so in a distance, we could see what appeared to be thunderstorms and rainstorms, but we needed to head straight in the direction of where we were going. And I was totally fascinated by the situation that we were in. I was totally engrossed, of course, a very curious individual myself. I just, my eyeballs were sucking up all the candy, all the eye candy that was all around, particularly up the head of the storms that were up ahead, unaware at that time that the storms would result in me getting dumped from the helicopter into a quagmire. But I didn't know it at that time. I was just enjoying the trip. And we were chatting with I was chatting with the nurses, the medical personnel. I did not chat with the pilot, of course, because he was a man. He needed to do what he needed to do. I didn't want to bother that person at all. So it was kind of fun, but there was a lot of radio chatter, and the radio chatter between the aircraft and the Reno Tower. As I recall, we were in constant contact. And as I recall, I don't know all the lingo of pilots and the people that are in the control towers, but I remember hearing something about unexpected weather in the direction of where we were headed. Pilot didn't seem concerned about that, as I recall, and neither did the nurses. And we were chatting. I was asking the nurses about this piece of equipment and that piece of equipment and what the various devices on board were, because I just wanted to see what this was about. And at that point, as I had said, I intended to write a story about this experience and about how the helicopter was vital in rescuing a critically ill patient. So we continued on as planned, and nobody seemed nervous on board. I wasn't nervous at that point at all either. And we continued on toward our destination, which was a tiny little town right next to U.S. Highway 395 near the Mammoth area. And the Mammoth area is famous for its snow skiing, is one of the most glorious snow skiing resorts in the world. So I was looking forward to seeing that. I was looking forward to watching the medical personnel do what they could to keep the patient who apparently had suffered a heart attack alive. And so I was just engrossed by this situation. To me, it seemed like the tension kept growing. There was more tension, but all the medical personnel and the pilot, they didn't seem tense. But I sensed a certain professional tension growing. They were planning to do what they needed to do. There was communications. The nurses were communicating with each other about IVs and medications. And so I was engrossed by that. I was taking notes, as I recall, about certain specifics that I could put in the story that I thought would be great for the newspaper's readers. I don't recall what the circulation of the newspaper was. It was in Reno that I worked for. I believe the circulation was something between 60,000 and 100,000 readers. So a lot of those readers potentially would be reading the story that I was going to write about this particular event. So as we got closer to our destination and as we approached the Nevada-California state line, which is right at Topaz, Nevada, and Topaz is right next to Topaz Lake, more communication came in, and the communication to me seemed garbled. I couldn't hear what the radio people were saying, but the pilot didn't seem worried. But all of a sudden, the rain was falling in torrents, and it was just, I could hardly see out the window. Of course, the pilot had mechanisms that enabled him to be able to see straight ahead, and he, of course, had his radar systems within the helicopter. And like I say, nobody seemed concerned, so we kept heading toward our destination, and we got closer. The pilot indicated, and the nurses indicated, that we were within maybe 20 minutes of our zone where we were going to land. So I was really anticipating going with the nurses. I call them nurses. I don't know what their exact titles were, but to the person that was ill. And we were going to stop at a local, what they call a hospital, but by big city standards, it wasn't much of a hospital. Pretty much it was just a room with a few medical personnel and maybe some IVs and whatnot. So the rain intensified, and it was one of the heaviest rains I've seen in my lifetime. I lived in the western United States, so when it rains, it seems like it's a lot here, but by many standards around the country, including parts of the East Coast, Florida, New York, or Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania, even parts of the Midwest. This was just probably a little tiny downpour by their standards, but to me it was like a huge, like all the water possible was falling out from the sky. So as we were I'd say we were around 10 minutes from our intended destination, we started to lower in altitude in advance to do what the crew on the aircraft needed to do the professional things they needed to do to save the life, to keep the person alive where we got. And the pilot said a message was coming in. It was a sudden message, an urgent message. And the urgent message was that there had been a stabbing in that community that we were about to land in. And a person was stabbed in a bar, critically stabbed. Somebody had stabbed the person in the chest. And as a result, we were going to have to bring back 2 patients instead of 1, which had been originally planned. It was at that point that I noticed, to my great surprise, that the nurses were giving kind of a concerned look toward each other. And they indicated to me some words to the effect, I don't remember their exact words, and they said to me, you know what this means. And well, I shrugged my shoulders. I said, well, I don't know what it means. And they said, it means we can't fly you back to Reno after we pick up these patients because the person who was stabbed weighs about the same that you do, Duke, and the helicopter's fuel only has enough to accommodate the weights which we had planned for. So you're going to have to stay in the town where we are going to land, and you're going to have to figure out your own way to get home. I didn't complain. That's just what is. What is. The helicopter landed. I believe there was somebody that was on the landing pad that kind of signaled us in, but as soon as we got off the aircraft, my legs, my feet were deep in mud. The helicopter had landed me into a quagmire with nowhere to go and no way to get home. So I walked maybe 10 yards from the helicopter as the blades stopped spinning around, and I wanted to watch the scene as it progressed. After a little bit, I saw the nurses. I call them nurses. I'll just call them nurses. They were rolling out one, I'll call it a gurney, and it was kind of stuck in the mud, so they kind of had to carry the person. I think the pilot was helping them, and they put the person on a little platform inside the helicopter, and then after they did that, the pilot and the personnel, they went back to what I call a hospital, but it was just a little tiny building, and they transported and moved the person that was stabbed into the helicopter, and I just stood there and watched. My notepad, which I had taken, was drenched, so I could no longer take notes. I didn't really have a coat because I didn't plan to be in inclement weather of any kind. So my entire body was sopping wet in the cold rain. And I watched them all get in the aircraft, and they all waved goodbye to me as the aircraft took off. But after a few moments, I couldn't even see the aircraft up in the sky because it was raining so hard. So then where was I going to go? What was I going to do? You got to do what you got to do when you got to do it. That's the way the old saying goes. When the going gets tough, I know it's a cliche, the tough get going. And I had to find my own way home. So, my feet were drenched. And as I recall, I was wearing kind of business style shoes and slacks that would have been appropriate, well pressed, appropriate for a professional journalist. But that didn't matter anymore. My clothes didn't matter anymore. I trenched through mud that was this thick, and every time I stepped into pure muck, and there was no cab to take me. I think they did indicate that there would be no transportation services available, no cab, nothing. So I walked out to the highway, US Highway 395. It was raining so hard, but I looked both ways, of course, and I ran across the road, and I almost slipped right onto the pavement right in the middle of the highway during this horrific rainstorm. But I did get myself up. I made my way across, I believe, as I might have indicated. I was around, I would say I was around 27 or 28 years old, and I realized right away my best hope was to hitchhike. So I started walking uh, northbound on US Highway 395 in the direction toward Reno, Nevada. And it would have taken me, if I had walked the entire distance, if there had been no hindrances, it likely would have taken me 2.5 to 3 days to walking all the way home, which is, of course, not what I was planning to do. Uh, so I held my thumb out to do the hitchhiking thing. And after about 15 minutes, a car passed. And after another 15 minutes or 20 minutes, another car passed, but I kept walking. Like I say, you got to do what you got to do. Oh, yes, I got dropped by a helicopter into a quagmire. It wasn't their fault, those medical professionals and the pilots. They were just doing what they had to do. So I had no anger toward them. I didn't feel bad for myself. I just did what I knew that I was going to get home somehow. I just needed to toe the line. I needed to be a good person and strong and sturdy. By this point, I would estimate it was around 10 o'clock at night, and I believe it was a weekday, and I needed to get home to my family because they needed me. I had 2 young daughters at that time, and I took really good care of them. But I essentially worked 2 simultaneous jobs at this particular time. During the mornings, I babysat a house full of young children to earn extra income for our family because the pay of a reporter it was laughable. It was so small, it was just pretty laughable. It was not a living wage, but this is what I did for my uh, profession. And I had to babysit this house full of children. I was licensed, I was checked out by all the officials, and I passed all the tests or whatever it was required. And they had inspections all the time to make sure everything was okay. But the little children that we babysat in our house were about ages, I'd say 2.5 to 5-ish. And so there's no children in this story I'm telling you about. There's no specific children in the story I'm telling you about because they're not part of the story. I'm just telling you what I had to do. My wife at the time attended the university so that she could get an electrical engineering degree. And so her business, which she ran before she started becoming a student, was babysitting these little kids. So that's what I had to do. I had to get home and babysit this little house full of kids. I essentially worked 8 plus 6, whatever. I worked 14 hours a day to make a living for our family. And I don't thank the glorious newspaper that I worked for. I think it was called the Reno Gazette-Journal. That's what it was called. And the pay was pathetic. But it was a good job. It was a professional job. And it gave some respect. And I had great reviews at that time for my exceptional work in the newspaper environment. There were a lot of annual reviews, and so I was respected in that regard. And there was a chance for advancement for me over time, which I did seize later over time. But I would say it was about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours after I got dropped into a quagmire. It was around midnight and it kept raining and the rain kept falling hard. And only a few cars passed me and there was nobody stopped, nobody I don't know that they even saw me. And so I believe I looked at my watch at one point, and it indicated that it was around 12:30, so it was a half past midnight, and the rain dissipated. The skies opened up, and I could see stars. And I stuck my hand out to hitchhike, and somebody stopped. Somebody stopped to pick me up. I think maybe it was close to 1 in the morning, and boy, was I happy. I didn't know how far this person was going to go, and it was a man. I think he was probably 55, and he had this big, giant, chunky beard, and he was wearing some clunky clothes. He was probably a woodsman, probably worked in the woods to cut and chop wood. I don't know what he did. All I could care about, I was so grateful that somebody had the heart to pick me up. I guess I looked like I was safe, or for whatever reason, I didn't feel uncomfortable in this guy's car. And I said, "Oh, Bill, where are you headed?" Well, he said, Minden, Gardnerville, which is about just it's probably an hour south of Reno when you're driving. So that was a good place for me to stop off, I believed. And so when we stopped off in Minden, Gardnerville, I ran to the payphone and called my wife at the time, the mother of my children, and told her what had happened. And I said, I have every intention of being home at the appointed time. So I got dropped off in Minden, Gardnerville. Like I say, I called her via payphone because at that time, as a lot of you might not realize, in around 1983 or 1984, cell phones did not yet exist. There was something called payphones, and I just barely had enough cash in my pocket to pay for the payphone, but I did not have any credit cards because I didn't use credit cards because I didn't go into any debt. We had a little tiny house and we paid our mortgage, but I didn't have any credit cards. And at that time, debit cards existed, debit cards where you take money right out of your bank, but I didn't have any debit card. Seems like a great oversight on my part looking back. Otherwise, I might have just, hired a cab or some kind of a transportation there in Minden, Gardnerville, but I did not. So I walked through town, and but at that point, I'm just guessing it was about 3 in the morning when I started, and I walked all the way through the community of Minden and Gardnerville, which are adjacent to each other. So I got through town, and then my thumb went out, and I was going, and it's about a half hour at that time in a car from Minden, Gardnerville to Carson City, Nevada. And around 4 o'clock in the morning, I got picked up and taken to Carson City. The person dropped me off in Carson City. They left. I think it was another man. I don't really remember much about that individual. And so then I was in Carson City. And of course, you don't want to be hitchhiking in the middle of Carson City. At that time, U.S. Interstate 580, which is a big interstate which now exists through Carson, it did not exist at that time. So I couldn't hitchhike onto 580. The only way to get through Carson City was to go all the way through Carson City. And Carson City, as if you might not know, it's the capital of Nevada. It's the capital city. A lot of people would think it's Las Vegas, but it isn't Las Vegas. And Reno and Carson City are about 450 miles from Las Vegas. A lot of people watching this might think that Reno and Las Vegas are like right next to each other, but that is certainly not the case. So I walked all the way through Carson City, got picked up when I was right at when the U.S. Highway 395 resumed. Somebody picked me up, took me all the way to Reno, and when I got dropped off in Reno, I walked all the way home, and it took me about an hour and 15 minutes because I walked about 1 mile every 15 minutes, and I was not really exhausted, and I got home just in time for my wife at the time to leave for her university classes, and as more young children got dropped off at our home for me to babysit for about 6 straight hours till my swing shift began at the newspaper. And for the rest of my life, I'm always going to remember my time that I got dropped off by a helicopter into a quagmire. And like I say, don't do this to yourself.